The convenience store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Private James Cooper walked through the automatic doors, his boots squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. It was late evening, and after a long day of processing paperwork at his new military base, all he wanted was some energy drinks and snacks. The store was relatively quiet, with just a few customers browsing the aisles. Cooper headed straight for the beverage section, his mind preoccupied with thoughts about starting his new assignment tomorrow. He'd worked hard to get this position, and his family back home was proud of him for joining the military. At 22, he felt like he was finally doing something meaningful with his life. As he reached for a pack of energy drinks, he noticed a woman in casual clothes, jeans and a simple black t-shirt, studying the labels on some sports drinks nearby. She was standing right where he needed to be, and something about her presence irritated him. Maybe it was the stress of the move or the anxiety about tomorrow, but his mood suddenly darkened. "Excuse me," he said, his tone sharper than necessary. The woman didn't immediately move, absorbed in reading the label. Cooper's irritation grew. He'd grown up in a small town where he rarely interacted with people different from himself, and his limited worldview was about to cause him serious trouble. "Hey, I'm trying to get something here," he said louder, taking a step closer. The woman turned slightly, giving him a calm, measured look. She was probably in her mid-30s, with an athletic build and a presence that should have warned Cooper to check his attitude. But he wasn't thinking clearly. "There's plenty of space," she replied evenly, gesturing to the open area beside her. "You can reach around me." Something about her composed response made Cooper's blood boil. Who was she to tell him what to do? He was a soldier now, and in his misguided thinking, that meant something. "Look, I don't have time for this. Just move aside," he demanded, his voice rising enough that other customers started to take notice. The woman straightened up, still holding her drink bottle. "I'll be done in a moment." "There's no need for hostility," she said firmly but professionally, the kind of tone that suggested she was used to dealing with difficult people. Cooper's next actions would haunt him for months to come. He stepped forward, intentionally invading her personal space, and roughly shoved past her, causing her to stumble slightly. "Lend some respect," he spat out, adding a racist remark that made nearby customers gasp. The woman regained her balance gracefully, her expression changing from surprise to something more complex, disappointment mixed with determination. Instead of responding to his aggression, she calmly noted the name tape on his uniform. Cooper was too worked up to notice her methodical observation or the way she pulled out her phone and appeared to make a quick note. The store manager, having witnessed the scene, started walking toward them. But before he could intervene, the woman had already gathered her items and was heading to the checkout counter. She moved with a purposeful stride that suggested this wasn't the end of the matter. Cooper, still fuming but somehow also feeling uneasy about his outburst, grabbed his energy drinks and walked to a different checkout counter. The other customers gave him a wide berth, some shaking their heads in disgust. The young cashier rang up his items quickly, clearly wanting him gone from the store as soon as possible. As Cooper left the store, the cool night air hit his face, and the first hints of shame began to creep in. He'd lost his temper, and deep down, he knew his behavior had been wrong. But rather than acknowledge this, he pushed the feeling aside, telling himself the woman had been difficult on purpose. Back in his car, he tossed the energy drinks into the passenger seat and sat there for a moment. Through the store window, he could see the woman talking to the manager, her demeanor completely professional. Something about her composure made him uncomfortable, but he started his car and drove away, trying to convince himself it didn't matter. Little did Cooper know, but his actions that evening had been captured crystal clear on the store's security cameras. The woman he'd assaulted had taken note not just of his name, but also his unit patch and other identifying details on his uniform. She handled the situation with remarkable restraint, but not because she was powerless, rather because she knew exactly how to handle it through proper channels. As Cooper drove back to his temporary housing, his mind was already shifting to thoughts about tomorrow. He was eager to make a good impression on his first date with his new unit. He'd iron his uniform extra carefully and arrive early to show his dedication. The incident at the store began to fade from his thoughts, becoming just another uncomfortable memory he chose to ignore. That night, as he laid out his uniform and polished his boots, Cooper had no idea that his world was about to be turned upside down. The woman from the store was not who he'd assumed she was, and his actions would have consequences far beyond anything he could imagine. Tomorrow would bring a lesson in humility, respect, and leadership that would change his life forever. The security footage from that evening would soon become a teaching moment for an entire battalion, though not in the way Cooper might have expected. His late-night stop for energy drinks would turn into a pivotal moment in his military career, one that would force him to confront his prejudices and reshape his entire worldview. As the night settled over the military base, two very different people prepared for the next day. In one corner of the base, Cooper drifted off to sleep, oblivious to what awaited him. In another part of the base, in a well-appointed office, the woman from the store was already preparing to handle the situation with the kind of leadership that would eventually earn her the respect of every soldier under her command, including, eventually, Cooper himself. The morning sun had barely risen when Cooper woke up, his stomach churning with first-day nerves. He'd laid out his freshly pressed uniform the night before, determined to make the best possible impression at his new unit. The memory of the convenience store incident lingered faintly in his mind, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. After a quick breakfast of coffee and a protein bar, Cooper stood before his mirror, meticulously checking every detail of his uniform. His boots gleamed from last night's polishing, and his name tape sat perfectly straight above his right pocket. The reflection showed a young soldier who looked every bit the professional he aspired to be, though his eyes betrayed a hint of anxiety. Cooper arrived at the battalion headquarters 30 minutes early, parking his car in the visitors section since he hadn't yet been assigned a permanent spot. The morning air was crisp, and other soldiers were already arriving, many carrying coffee cups and gym bags. He took a deep breath, grabbed his paperwork, and headed toward the main entrance. The first sign that something was off came when he approached a group of soldiers standing near the door. Their conversation died abruptly as he passed, and he could feel their eyes following him. Cooper chalked it up to being the new guy. Every unit had its way of sizing up fresh arrivals. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt strange. A senior NCO who had been walking down the hallway did a double-take upon seeing Cooper, then quickly disappeared into an office. Through the office window, Cooper could see the NCO speaking in hushed tones to several others, all of them glancing his way. "Maybe I put my uniform on wrong," Cooper muttered to himself, ducking into a bathroom to check his appearance again. Everything looked perfect in the mirror, which only made the odd reactions more confusing. As he exited the bathroom, he nearly collided with a young specialist who actually took a step backward upon seeing him. "Sorry about that," Cooper said, trying to sound friendly. The specialist just nodded and hurried past, leaving Cooper even more bewildered. Making his way to the company office, Cooper could hear snippets of conversations that seemed to stop whenever he got too close. He caught phrases like, "Did you hear about last night?" and "Can't believe someone would," before voices would drop to whispers. The back of his neck began to prickle with unease. The company clerk, a cheerful-looking staff sergeant, was the first person to actually maintain eye contact with him that morning. "Private Cooper?" she asked, checking her computer screen. "You're right on time. First formation is in 20 minutes, but the first sergeant wants to see you first." Cooper's heart rate picked up. It wasn't unusual for a first sergeant to meet new soldiers, but something in the clerk's tone made him nervous. She led him to an office where the first sergeant, a seasoned veteran with 3 decades of service visible in the lines of his face, was waiting. "Private Cooper," the first sergeant said, his expression unreadable. "Have a seat." The words weren't unfriendly, but they carried a weight that made Cooper's mouth go dry. "Yes, First Sergeant," Cooper replied, sitting ramrod straight in the chair. The first sergeant studied him for a moment, then asked, "How was your evening yesterday, Private?" The question hit Cooper like a bucket of ice water. Suddenly, the strange looks and hushed conversations made sense. His encounter at the convenience store hadn't been as consequence-free as he'd hoped. I went to the store, First Sergeant," Cooper managed to say, his voice smaller than he'd have liked. The first sergeant nodded. "Anything else you'd like to tell me about that store visit?" Before Cooper could respond, there was a knock at the door. Another senior NCO poked his head in. "First Sergeant, battalion formation in 10 minutes. They want everyone there, especially." His eyes flickered to Cooper meaningfully. "Roger that," the first sergeant replied. He turned back to Cooper. We'll finish this conversation later. For now, fall in with your platoon. Staff Sergeant Rivera will show you where to go." As Cooper followed Staff Sergeant Rivera out to the formation area, he noticed more soldiers than usual for a standard morning formation. There was an energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that made his palms sweat. Units were forming up with precision, and he could see several officers gathering near the battalion headquarters building. Staff Sergeant Rivera positioned Cooper in the third row of their platoon formation. "Stay sharp," was all he said before taking his place at the front. Cooper stood at parade rest, trying to ignore the sideways glances from his new squad mates. The battalion command sergeant major called the formation to attention, and Cooper could hear the collective snap of hundreds of boots. As he stared straight ahead, he caught movement near the battalion headquarters door. Several officers were emerging, and among them, Cooper's heart stopped. There, wearing the oak leaves of a major and walking with confident authority, was the woman from the convenience store. Her uniform was impeccable, her bearing perfect, and her gaze swept across the formation with calm authority. In that moment, Cooper felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The full impact of his actions from the previous night crashed over him like a wave. He had assaulted a field-grade officer. Not just any officer, but from the way others were deferring to her, someone in his direct chain of command. As the major took her place front and center, Cooper fought to maintain his military bearing while his mind raced through the possible consequences of his actions. The strange looks, the whispers, the first sergeant's questions, everything made terrible sense now. The formation went silent as the battalion commander stepped forward to speak. Cooper barely heard the words over the sound of his own heartbeat. Standing there in the morning sun, surrounded by hundreds of other soldiers, he had never felt more alone. What happened next would reshape not just Cooper's military career, but his entire understanding of leadership, respect, and his own prejudices. As he stood rigidly at attention, he realized this was more than just a first day at a new unit. It was the beginning of a profound lesson in humility and personal growth. The battalion commander's voice carried across the formation with practiced authority, but Cooper barely registered the usual morning announcements. His entire focus was fixed on the major standing at parade rest beside the commander, the same woman he'd confronted at the convenience store just hours ago. And now, the commander's voice cut through Cooper's racing thoughts. "I'd like to introduce our new battalion executive officer, Major Thompson, who joined us last night from Fort Benning. She brings with her 15 years of experience and multiple combat deployments." Cooper felt his throat tighten as Major Thompson stepped forward. She looked exactly as composed as she had in the store, but now her civilian clothes were replaced by a sharply pressed uniform decorated with combat patches and awards that spoke of a distinguished career. "Thank you, sir," Major Thompson began, her voice clear and confident. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you." Her eyes swept across the formation, pausing briefly, very briefly, on Cooper's position. That split second of eye contact felt like an eternity to him. The formation was dismissed shortly after, but Cooper's platoon sergeant held them back. "Private Cooper," he called out, "report to the battalion XO's office in 15 minutes." The walk to his doom, as Cooper was now thinking of it, felt like the longest of his life. The hallways of the battalion headquarters seemed to stretch endlessly. Other soldiers he passed either stared openly or quickly looked away, all of them clearly aware of what had happened. Outside the XO's office, Cooper found himself standing next to a staff sergeant who was holding what looked like security camera footage on a USB drive. His stomach dropped even further. Of course, there had been cameras. The staff sergeant gave him a look that mixed disappointment with something like pity before knocking on the door. "Enter," came Major Thompson's voice. The office was larger than Cooper had expected, with military awards and diplomas lining the walls. Major Thompson sat behind her desk, reading through some paperwork. She looked up as they entered, her expression professional and unreadable. "Private Cooper reporting as ordered, ma'am," Cooper managed to say, his voice barely steady. "At ease," she replied, studying him with the same calm demeanor she'd shown in the store. "Staff Sergeant Chen, please play the footage." The next 5 minutes were excruciating as Cooper watched himself on the wall-mounted screen, seeing his actions from an outside perspective for the first time. The security footage had crystal-clear audio, and his words seemed even worse now than he remembered them. He could feel his face burning with shame as his recorded self shoved past the Major, throwing out that racist remark. When the video ended, Major Thompson let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "Private Cooper," she finally said, "would you like to explain your actions?" Cooper swallowed hard. "No excuse, ma'am," he replied, because there wasn't one. Standing there, watching himself act like that, he couldn't believe he'd been so stupid, so arrogant, so wrong. "I agree, there is no excuse," Major Thompson said. "But I am interested in understanding what led to this behavior. You're new to the Army, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "I've been in for 8 months. And before that?" "Small town in the Midwest, ma'am. Population about 2,000. Major Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And in that town, did you have much interaction with people who looked different from you?" The question hit home. "No, ma'am," Cooper admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let me be clear, Private Cooper," Major Thompson continued, leaning forward slightly. "Your actions last night were completely unacceptable, not just because I'm an officer, but because that's not how soldiers, how human beings, should treat each other. The Army is a reflection of our entire nation, all races, all backgrounds, working together. We succeed or fail as one team." Cooper stood there, each word hitting him like a physical blow. The worst part was that she wasn't yelling or showing anger. Her disappointment was far more devastating than any screaming could have been. "The Army has zero tolerance for racism or discrimination of any kind," she continued. "You're young, and you're new to this environment, but that doesn't excuse your behavior. What you did last night was an assault, both physical and verbal. Do you understand the seriousness of this situation?" "Yes, ma'am," Cooper replied, his voice cracking slightly. Major Thompson picked up a folder from her desk. "I've reviewed your training records. Your drill sergeants noted that you showed potential for leadership. But leadership starts with respect, for everyone, regardless of their rank, race, or background." She stood up and walked around her desk, stopping directly in front of Cooper. "You have a choice to make, Private. This incident could end your military career before it really begins, or it could become a turning point. The path you take from here is up to you." Cooper felt tears threatening to form in his eyes, but he blinked them back. "I want to do better, ma'am. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I am." "You're right, sorry isn't enough," Major Thompson agreed. "Actions matter more than words. You'll be facing disciplinary action, including a formal counseling statement, extra duty, and mandatory diversity training. But more importantly, you need to take a hard look at yourself and decide what kind of soldier, what kind of person you want to be." She returned to her desk and sat down. "Report to First Sergeant for your extra duty schedule. Dismissed." As Cooper left the office, his mind was spinning. The shame of his actions weighed heavily on him, but something else was taking root too, a determination to learn from this, to prove that he could be better than the person in that security footage. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would mark the beginning of a profound change in his life. Behind him, Major Thompson watched the door close, then turned to Staff Sergeant Chen. "Keep an eye on him," she said quietly. "Sometimes the hardest lessons create the best leaders, if they're willing to learn." The consequences of Cooper's actions unfolded swiftly over the next few days. The First Sergeant didn't waste any time implementing Major Thompson's disciplinary recommendations, and Cooper found himself facing a carefully structured program of correction. His first stop was the battalion legal office, where a stern-faced captain explained the formal process ahead. The incident was being handled at the company level rather than through higher channels, a mercy Cooper hadn't expected and didn't feel he deserved. "You should know," the captain said, sliding a document across the desk. "Major Thompson specifically requested this stay at company level. She believes in handling these matters in a way that creates positive change rather than just punishment." Cooper stared at the paperwork, a formal counseling statement that would become part of his record. The document detailed his actions at the convenience store in stark, professional language that made him wince as he read it. "Sign here," the captain pointed, "acknowledging that you understand the nature of the offense and accept the prescribed corrective training." The prescribed corrective training turned out to be comprehensive. Each day after his regular duties, Cooper reported for extra duty that ranged from physical labor to educational sessions. The first sergeant had crafted a program that was both punishing and purposeful. The physical portions weren't just mindless work. Instead of having him pull weeds or pick up trash, they assigned him to help renovate the base's community center, a place where military families of all backgrounds gathered. Cooper spent hours painting walls, fixing furniture, and setting up new children's play areas, all under the watchful eye of his supervisors. But it was the educational components that truly began to transform his thinking. Rather than simple PowerPoint presentations about diversity, he was assigned to work with the base's Equal Opportunity Office. The EO advisor, a seasoned warrant officer, didn't lecture him. Instead, she shared stories, real experiences from soldiers who had faced discrimination throughout their careers. "Take notes," she told him on his first day. "You're going to help organize next month's diversity awareness training for new arrivals." Cooper found himself immersed in research, reading about military leaders from various backgrounds who had shaped Army history. He learned about the Buffalo Soldiers, the Tuskegee Airmen, and modern-day generals who had broken barriers and led with distinction. During this time, he occasionally glimpsed Major Thompson around the battalion area. She never singled him out or treated him with anything less than professional courtesy. If anything, her calm, competent leadership style made him feel even more ashamed of his initial prejudices. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into his extra duty, Cooper was helping set up for a battalion town hall meeting when Major Thompson entered the room. She was deep in conversation with several other officers about upcoming training plans, and Cooper tried to make himself invisible as he arranged chairs. "Private Cooper," she called out, surprising him. "A moment, please." He approached nervously, wondering if he'd done something else wrong. But her expression was thoughtful rather than stern. "How's the community center renovation coming along?" she asked. "Almost finished with the main room, ma'am," he replied. "The new youth center should be ready next week." She nodded. "Good. I understand you've been putting in extra hours there, beyond what was required." It was true. Cooper had found himself staying late several times, wanting to complete projects properly rather than just doing the minimum. Working alongside the center's staff, hearing their stories and seeing their dedication to helping military families had become unexpectedly meaningful. "Yes, ma'am," he acknowledged. "They're doing important work there." "They are," she agreed. "And I've heard good things about your contributions to the EO officers' training program." Cooper felt a small spark of pride, quickly tempered by the memory of what had brought him to this point. "I've learned a lot, ma'am. Things I should have known already." Major Thompson studied him for a moment. "Learning is a continuous process, Private. What matters is that when we recognize our mistakes, we work to correct them. Keep that in mind as you finish your extra duty period." That evening, as Cooper scrubbed paint off his hands after another session at the community center, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The extra duty hours were exhausting, but they had opened his eyes to a wider world than he'd known in his small hometown. His phone buzzed with a message from the EO office. They needed his draft of the training presentation by tomorrow. Cooper smiled slightly, remembering how he'd struggled with the first version. Now, after countless conversations and research sessions, he felt like he finally had something meaningful to contribute. The battalion grapevine had slowly shifted too. Where once there had been whispers and stares, now he occasionally heard comments about how seriously he was taking his correction. Some of the same NCOs who had initially viewed him with disgust now nodded in approval when they saw him working late at the community center. As he gathered his things to leave, Cooper passed the battalion headquarters. Through the window, he could see Major Thompson still at her desk, working late as usual. She looked up briefly, catching his eye, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Walking to his car, Cooper realized that what had started as punishment had become something more. The shame was still there, but alongside it was growing a new understanding of leadership, respect, and the true meaning of service. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time since that night at the convenience store, Cooper felt like he might actually deserve the second chance he'd been given. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more work, and more opportunities to prove that people really could change when they opened their minds and hearts to learning. The extra duty would end eventually, but Cooper was beginning to understand that his real education was just beginning. Major Thompson's approach, firm but focused on growth rather than pure punishment, was teaching him more about leadership than any manual could have. 1 month into his corrective training, Cooper sat in a quiet office with his assigned counselor, a retired sergeant major who specialized in working with soldiers facing disciplinary issues. The walls were decorated with various military memorabilia, creating an atmosphere that was both professional and approachable. "Tell me what's changed," the counselor said, leaning back in his chair. "Not what you think I want to hear, but what's actually different inside your head." Cooper took a moment to gather his thoughts. He'd been dreading and looking forward to this session, dreading having to face his own past attitudes, but eager to share the genuine changes he'd been experiencing. "I keep thinking about my grandfather," Cooper began. "He used to tell me stories about working in his garage, how he never cared what color his customers were as long as they were good people. I thought I understood what he meant back then, but I didn't. Not really." The counselor nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Last week at the community center, I was helping this family move some furniture. Their little girl was having trouble with her homework, so I spent some time helping her with math. Her parents were so grateful, and it hit me. This is what my grandfather was talking about. Just people helping people." "And how does that connect to what happened at the store?" the counselor asked. Cooper felt the familiar shame rise up, but he pushed through it. "I didn't see a person that night. I saw a category. Something my mind had already labeled and dismissed. But working at the center, helping with the EO training, I started really seeing people. Their stories, their lives, their struggles and achievements." The counselor made a few notes before looking up. "Tell me about working with Major Thompson." "She's..." Cooper paused, searching for the right words. "She's everything I wasn't that night. Professional, focused on the mission, treating everyone with respect. Sometimes I watch how she handles difficult situations, and I'm amazed at her patience." "Have you had any direct interactions with her since the initial counseling?" "Yes, sir. She checks on the progress of my projects, but she never mentions the incident. It's like she's more interested in who I'm becoming than who I was." The counselor set down his notepad. "That's called leadership, son. She's showing you what it looks like." Later that day, Cooper arrived at the community center for his usual shift. The director waved him over as soon as he walked in. "We've got a situation with the teen room," she explained. "The volunteers scheduled for today called in sick, and we've got a group coming in an hour." Without hesitation, Cooper offered to stay late and help. As he set up the activities and arranged the space, he couldn't help but notice how different this felt from his first days of extra duty. What had started as punishment now felt like purpose. The teens arrived. A diverse group of military kids dealing with deployed parents, frequent moves, and all the normal challenges of adolescence. Cooper found himself leading a basketball activity, then helping with homework, and finally moderating a discussion about college plans. "You're good with them," the director commented as the last teens left. "They respond to authenticity." Cooper thought about that as he cleaned up. A few months ago, he would have felt uncomfortable in this situation. Now he saw each kid as an individual with their own story, their own dreams and struggles. That evening, he had to present his progress report to his chain of command. Standing in front of his platoon sergeant and first sergeant, Cooper shared not just what he'd done, but what he'd learned. "The community center needs permanent volunteers," he concluded. "With your permission, I'd like to continue helping there after my extra duty period ends." The first sergeant exchanged glances with the platoon sergeant. "You understand this would be on your own time?" "Yes, first sergeant, it's important work." After the meeting, Cooper walked to his car through the gathering dusk. He spotted Major Thompson leaving the headquarters building carrying a stack of files. Without thinking, he changed direction to open the door for her. "Thank you, Private Cooper," she said, then paused. "I heard about your request to continue at the community center." "Yes, ma'am. I've learned a lot there." She studied him for a moment. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most important growth. Good evening, Private." Driving home, Cooper reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The anger and prejudice that had driven his actions that night at the store seemed foreign now, like looking at a stranger's memories. His phone lit up with a message from one of the teens at the center, thanking him for helping with college application essays. Cooper smiled, remembering his own uncertainty at that age. Now he was helping others navigate their futures while building a better version of himself. The next morning, he had another session scheduled with his counselor. They would discuss his progress, his insights, and his plans for continuing this journey of growth. Cooper knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments when old thoughts might try to surface. But he also knew he was building something stronger than his past prejudices: understanding, empathy, and a genuine desire to be part of positive change. As he prepared for bed, Cooper caught sight of his uniform hanging ready for tomorrow. The same uniform he'd worn that night at the store now represented something different to him, not just authority or status, but responsibility. Responsibility to be better, to lead by example, and to help others the way Major Thompson had, ultimately, helped him. The incident that could have ended his career had instead begun his real education in what it meant to be a soldier and, more importantly, a better human being. There was still work to do, but for the first time, Cooper felt truly worthy of wearing that uniform. 6 months after the convenience store incident, Cooper stood in front of a room full of new soldiers, preparing to give a presentation on diversity and inclusion. He took a deep breath, remembering how far he'd come from that night that had changed everything. "Before I start," he said, looking around the room, "I want to tell you a story. Not from a PowerPoint or a manual, but something that happened to me right here on this base." The room grew quiet as Cooper shared his experience honestly, leaving nothing out. He described his behavior at the store, the shock of discovering who Major Thompson was, and the journey that followed. As he spoke, he could see recognition in some faces, discomfort in others, but everyone was listening. "I'm not proud of what I did," he continued, "but I'm grateful for what it taught me. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become turning points if we're willing to learn from them." After the presentation, several soldiers stayed behind to talk. One young private admitted he came from a similar background and struggled with his own prejudices. Another shared stories about facing discrimination in his hometown. Cooper listened to each of them, remembering his own counseling sessions. Later that afternoon, Cooper headed to the community center, where he now volunteered 3 times a week. The extra duty period had ended months ago, but he kept his promise to stay involved. The center had become more than just a place of redemption. It was where he could actually see the impact of his changed perspective. "Mr. Cooper," called out one of the regular kids, a 12-year-old whose mother was deployed overseas, "can you help me with my science project?" As Cooper sat down to help, he noticed a new family hovering uncertainly near the entrance. He remembered his training and approached them with a warm smile. "Welcome to the center," he said. "First time here." The father, wearing the stripes of a staff sergeant, nodded. "Just got stationed here last week, trying to help the kids adjust." "Well, you came to the right place," Cooper replied, giving them a tour. As they walked, he pointed out various programs and activities, watching their tension slowly ease. By the end of the tour, the kids were already asking when they could come back. During his lunch break, Cooper sat with some other volunteers, sharing stories and planning upcoming events. The diversity of the group struck him, different ranks, backgrounds, and experiences all working together. He thought about how uncomfortable this would have made him just months ago. "Hey, Cooper," called one of the program coordinators. "Major Thompson is coming by later to review our youth mentorship proposal. Can you stay to present your part?" "Of course," he replied, feeling a mix of nervous energy and pride. He'd helped develop a new program aimed at connecting military teens with positive role models in the community. It was exactly the kind of initiative he would have dismissed as unnecessary in his previous mindset. When Major Thompson arrived, Cooper presented the proposal professionally, highlighting how the program would support military families during deployments and transitions. She listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about implementation and resources. "Good work, Private Cooper," she said afterward. "This could make a real difference for our families." Walking back to his car that evening, Cooper passed the convenience store where everything had started. He sometimes shopped there now, always treating every person he encountered with respect. The clerk who had witnessed his outburst months ago now greeted him with a friendly nod, having seen his transformation over time. At home, Cooper opened his laptop to work on his application for the Better Opportunities for Single Soldiers (BOSS) program leadership team. His first sergeant had suggested he apply, noting how his volunteer work and personal growth made him a strong candidate. As he typed, Cooper reflected on the changes in his life. His relationships with fellow soldiers had deepened as he'd learned to see beyond surface differences. His leadership skills had grown through his work at the community center. Even his understanding of himself had expanded. His phone buzzed with a message from one of the teens he mentored, sharing news about a college acceptance. Cooper smiled, remembering their early tutoring sessions. Small victories like this made every step of his journey worthwhile. The next morning at physical training, Cooper noticed a new private struggling to keep up. Instead of judging or ignoring them, he fell back to offer encouragement. "Keep pushing," he said between breaths. "We'll finish together." After PT, his platoon sergeant pulled him aside. "The battalion's putting together a diversity working group," he said. "Given your experience with the community center and your recent presentation, we'd like you to represent the company." Cooper felt the weight of responsibility in that request. "I'd be honored, Sergeant." As he prepared for another day of duties, Cooper thought about how his mistake had led to unexpected opportunities for growth and service. The journey wasn't over. He still had much to learn and improve, but he was no longer the same person who had walked into that convenience store 6 months ago. His uniform felt different now, not just as a symbol of service, but as a reminder of the continuous duty to grow, learn, and help others do the same. The Army had given him a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it, one day and one interaction at a time. That afternoon, as he helped another family at the community center, Cooper caught his reflection in a window. He saw someone his grandfather would have been proud of, not because he was perfect, but because he was trying to be better every day. 1 year after the convenience store incident, Cooper stood at attention in the battalion conference room, surrounded by his fellow soldiers. The occasion was the annual battalion awards ceremony, but his mind was on the journey that had brought him here. "Next award," announced the battalion commander, "is for outstanding community service. This recognition goes to a soldier who has shown exceptional dedication to improving our military community." Cooper listened politely, thinking about the team mentorship program meeting he had scheduled for later that day. He'd helped expand it to 3 other bases in the region, and the results were encouraging. "Private First Class Cooper, front and center," the commander called. For a moment, Cooper thought he'd misheard, but his platoon sergeant was already gesturing for him to move forward. As he marched to the front of the room, he caught sight of Major Thompson standing with the other staff officers, a subtle smile on her face. "Private First Class Cooper has volunteered over 500 hours at our base community center," the commander read. He developed a successful youth mentorship program, led diversity awareness training for new soldiers, and serves as president of our BOAS program. His dedication to building a stronger, more inclusive military community exemplifies the Army values. As the commander pinned the award on his chest, Cooper thought about how different this moment was from his first interaction with the battalion leadership. The same room where he'd once stood in shame now witnessed his recognition. After the ceremony, soldiers gathered for refreshments. Cooper found himself approached by a group of new privates who'd arrived the previous month. "Is it true what they say?" one asked. "About how you started volunteering?" Cooper shared his story once again, not hiding any of the difficult parts. He'd learned that honesty about his mistakes helped others confront their own biases. "The hardest part wasn't the extra duty," he explained. "It was facing myself and admitting I needed to change. But that change saved my career and made me a better soldier, a better person." Major Thompson walked over as he finished speaking. "Private First Class Cooper has become one of our strongest examples of transformational leadership," she said to the group. "He turned a mistake into a mission." Later that day, Cooper headed to the community center. The place had grown significantly over the past year, partly due to proposals he'd helped develop. Walking through the doors, he was greeted by familiar faces and new ones alike. PFC Cooper called one of his original mentees, now a high school senior. "I got accepted to State University. First one in my family to go to college." Moments like these meant more than any award. Cooper had learned that real change wasn't about recognition, it was about impact, about making a difference in people's lives. During the team mentorship meeting, Cooper listened as his mentees shared their experiences and challenges. Some talked about dealing with racism, others about feeling isolated during frequent moves. Each story reminded him of how much he'd learned about empathy and understanding. Remember, he told them, your background, your experiences, they're not limitations. They're part of what makes you unique and valuable. After the meeting, Cooper's phone buzzed with a message from his first sergeant. The battalion was organizing a leadership development course, and they wanted Cooper to share his experience with transformational growth. As he drove home that evening, Cooper passed the convenience store. He now shopped there regularly, and the staff knew him as the soldier who helped at the community center. The place that had once represented his lowest moment had become a reminder of how far he'd come. At home, Cooper found a letter from his grandfather. Opening it, he read words of pride about the man he'd become. His grandfather mentioned hearing about his community work from other military families in their hometown. "You've done what many can't," his grandfather wrote. "You faced your flaws and turned them into strength. That's real courage." The next morning at PT formation, Cooper looked around at his fellow soldiers, a diverse group united by purpose and values. He remembered how he'd once seen differences as barriers. Now he understood they were strengths that made their team more effective. His platoon sergeant approached after formation, battalions putting together a special committee, he said. They want soldiers who can speak from experience about overcoming prejudice and building unity. Interested? Cooper nodded. Always ready to help, Sergeant. As he prepared for another day of duties, Cooper reflected on the year's journey. The angry young soldier from that night at the store seemed like a different person now. He'd learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others, it was about lifting them up, about using your own experiences, even the painful ones, to help others grow. His awards sat on his desk at home, but the real rewards were in the daily moments, mentoring young soldiers, supporting military families, building bridges between different communities. He discovered that leadership wasn't about rank or position, it was about influence and impact. The day ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities. Cooper was ready for them, carrying the lessons of his journey, that change is possible, that mistakes can become stepping stones, and that every day brings a new chance to make a positive difference. As he walked into the battalion headquarters, several soldiers greeted him by name. They no longer saw him as the soldier who'd made a terrible mistake. They saw him as someone who'd shown them how to become better. And that, Cooper realized, was the greatest transformation of all.